Hello, this is the second of a pair of videos I'm making about drums in Eurorack. In this one I'm looking at two great sounding fully analogue drum modules from Patching Panda. Blast is a kick drum and Hatz is, you guessed it, a hi-hat module. In this video I'll give you a detailed overview of both modules and walk through all their parameters, then I'll build a couple of jams to let you hear them in context. As usual, you should find a few ideas for things to try no matter which modules you're using. Big thanks to Patching Panda for sponsoring this demo video. Here's a quick taste of what's coming up, then we'll get right into it. So let's start with a look at Blast. Both these modules are 10 HP wide, they both have inputs and outputs at the top and then a bank of 8 sliders below for the various parameters. Blast has a trigger input at the top left, there's also a manual trigger button which illuminates when the trigger comes in, and then the main audio input is top right. I'm going to run that through the scope into the mixer, otherwise it'll be completely dry, and I'm going to use PAMS Pro here to fire in a trigger pattern to get us going. I've got all the sliders minimized, so we're only going to hear a little click to begin with. But if I start to bring up the amplitude envelope decay on this slider here, we'll start to hear this kind of low sine wave tone. It's a sine wave based oscillator here. We've got a tuning slider, which goes nice and low. And there's a volt per octave input for the tuning as well, so you can use it as a bass voice or just modulate the pitch of your kicks. Let's get it sounding a bit more like a kick drum by adding a pitch envelope to this. So we've got a separate envelope with a pitch, decay and a mount. And as we start to nudge these up, we get this classic kick drum kind of transient forming at the start by accelerating the frequency and then coming back down to the bass frequency set by that tuning. So the more of this amount we add, the sort of zappier it gets. And if the decay goes up too, these really nice kind of zappy effects. So just with these envelopes it's quite easy to dial in a nice sounding kick. The ranges have been really well chosen so that things sit in the mix nicely, but we've got quite a lot of other tone shaping capabilities too. We've got shaping here which shapes that sine wave something a bit more sort of folded and square. It's going to just clips nicely. Gets you more into that kind of gabba kick territory. Then we've got compression and body as well, and I think these all kind of interact to affect the dynamics of the decaying portion of the envelope. Body really kind of extends that, raises the level of that decaying portion, and if you kind of add the compression as well and the shaping, things can get quite chunky and aggressive. Let's dial it into something like that, and let's have a look at the accent. So basically the accent input, as soon as you put a jack in, it will kind of reduce the level, and then when you accent at the same time as any of these triggers, it will bring things back up to that level that you've set. So let's get an accent pattern. So on beats 1 and 4 now we're getting an accent happening. CV wise, we've got inputs for the amplitude and pitch envelope decays. We've also got CV over the shape control. So we could, for example, have a low frequency kind of tempo synced LFO here, which is kind of bringing that shape down over the course of the bar. And we've also got an AM input, which is effectively a VCA over the whole output. Let's just go in there. As soon as I put a jack in here, it will kill the output because it's basically sending 0 volts in. I can use a manual offset from Quadrat here to control the level. Or we could use that same LFO from PAMs to let that decay over the course of the bar. You can also use this at audio rates, which I'll demonstrate in one of the patches. And you can just use it as a much more precise velocity control compared to the accent, if you want. Then finally, we've got this through 0 FM slider and input. With nothing connected, this feeds the output back in via the FM here, which kind of shapes the wave in a slightly unusual way. But you can also feed in an external source here to FM the tone. So let's take a triangle wave out of Platts. We can get these nice kind of quite subtle kind of FM tones. But yeah, it's just another kind of sonic dimension available to you here. And then finally at the very top we've got two other outputs. One outputs the amplitude envelope as a sort of CV signal, and the other one outputs an inverted version of that, which is really useful for sidechaining and other sort of things like that. I'll demonstrate that in one of the patches coming up. So that's Blast in a nutshell. Let's move over to Hatz. So Hatz has separate trigger inputs and audio outputs for closed and open hi-hats. So they both share the same noise source, which is this combination of metals and texture. Metals is kind of high-pitched square waves, and texture is a kind of digital noise. Let's get a little pattern coming in to the closed and open. And if I turn down the texture, that's just the metals noise. And that's just the texture noise. So by balancing these, and you have a CV input for the texture level as well, you can sort of dial in the perfect combination of noise. Then we've got bandpass filters for each. These each have CV inputs as well, so you can kind of like dial in exactly where you want the hi-hats to sit. You can also choke the open hi-hat with the closed. So the closed hi-hat will stop that long decay. If I turn the choke off, so that kind of tightens things up. The decay envelope sliders here set the time, and then we've got shape controls for those decay curves as well, from exponential to linear. At the bottom they're exponential, at the top they're linear. I think these graphics on my model are the wrong way around, but easy enough to remember. So the curves will get more linear and a bit longer as you go up. You can sort of dial in the precise kind of decay curve you want for the hats. And let's get some CV coming in as well. The accent works similarly to Blast, where once I insert that jack, it quietens everything down a bit. Now certain steps are being highlighted. And let's get some stepped random to the frequency. And maybe let's get some other stepped random to the texture as well. So that's the frequency of the closed hat being randomized. And let's bring the kick drum back in. One final thing to mention is this hold input, which is basically a VCA, which can replace the internal envelope, so you could use an external envelope of your choice, or you can just feed in an offset like this, which will just bring up that noise altogether. Works in conjunction with the envelopes, you get this quite nice effect, which I'll explore in one of the patches a bit later as well. So yeah, that's the basics covered. Let's move on to some more complex patches. So one of the features I really like on Blast is this built-in inverted envelope output, which is really useful for sidechain compressing or ducking other elements of the patch if you use it with a VCA. This is a really common mixing technique, especially in electronic dance music, and it helps other elements of the track kind of make way for the kick and let the kick punch through. Let me show you what I mean. I've got the positive version of the envelope going through the scope here. So if I get kick drum going, that's the shape of the decay envelope that's controlling the kick. Your standard kind of very sharp attack and fairly rapid exponential decay. If I go into the inverted version, this is basically high when nothing's happening. So if I stop the kick, you see it sort of sticks on a high voltage, which will keep your VCA open. And then when the kick fires, it closes down to 0 and then comes back up in between the beats. So if we bring in, say, a fairly standard kind of hi-hat pattern from Blast, and then take a copy of that envelope, the one that's going through data there, and go into the VCA input on the Megatang mixer, you can hear it's kind of closing down on the beats where the kick will be firing. The kick's actually not there, but it's kind of making space for it. If I bring the kick back in, so it's pretty subtle with hi-hats, but if I take out the envelope, you should hear now that where the kick's firing, the closed hi-hat's pretty audible. And with the envelope in, the hats are kind of ducking out of the way when the kick is actually active. Let's bring in another element. So this is a kind of 7-step pattern from Collide 4 in the second case. And if I bring copies of that same envelope to the VCAs, we're going to get the same kind of ducking effect. Kick like that. So it makes that kind of techno kind of groove feel really solid. And we get two quite distinct effects where whether we take out the kick from the mix but keep the envelopes firing, or stop the envelopes to the kick altogether, or stop the triggers to the kick altogether rather. You can hear all those other elements now rise up and become much more even. Some more elements and get the delay going a bit more. The kick really slams through now and chops into that sort of wall of sound. And compare that to just muting the kick on the mixer but keeping the envelopes going. I like both versions of that. It's quite nice having the kind of space already there for the kick, and then when it comes back in, Okay, for this next jam I'm going to build a slightly more complex beat that makes use of some of the modulation inputs on Blast and Hatz. Let's get a kick drum pattern going. So I'm using one of the melodic sequencer lanes on the BeatStep Pro here. So I've got volt per octave information going in, and I'm also using the velocity to modulate the amount of shape wavefolding. So this is somewhere between a kind of bass line and a kick drum. It's still got that kind of punch from that pitch envelope, giving it quite a bit of compression and body as well. And let's bring in some hi-hats from Hatz. So I've got a nice busy closed and open pattern. If I just mute the kick for a second, I've got stepped random modulation from PAMS Pro going into both frequency controls, so both the filters are being modulated randomly on each hit, and I'm also modulating the texture amount, so that's the level of the texture noise. And I'm not choking it so I can have that open hat decaying a bit longer. I've also got an offset voltage patch to the hold input, which is currently at 0, but if I turn up this pot on Quadrat, basically opens the VCA, you can really hear all that modulation happening to those noise sources now, and this is quite a nice effect for adding a bit of tension and release as part of a larger patch. And then just to finish off the beat, I've got a snare from Platts. Been having a little bit of fun as well using a voltage controlled switch and a voltage from PAMS, which I've set to basically turn on for 1 bar out of 4, and that switches in an oscillator to the AM input. Basically at the moment we've got a high offset voltage going into one side of the switch, and that's going to the AM, which is basically the VCA for the kick drum. It's just keeping that open. But if I unmute this PAMS channel, you get that AM effect there on that 1 bar, which is quite fun. So I'll leave that running. And just for a bit more fun, I'm going to send the drums to the 2051 bit corruptor in the MFX. Which brings in these nice kind of glitchy repetitions, and mute that AM switch again. Bit corruptor really makes this beat lively, and if I also up the probability of randomness on the BeatStep Pro, I'm just using the joystick over here on the left to control the bit rate of the bit corruptor, or the sampling frequency rather, and I can toggle it to reverse when it's repeating the buffer as well, like that. Loads of fun. Okay, to finish, I'm just going to build up a fairly straightforward kind of classic electro groove just to show you how Blast and Hatz sit in that kind of sound. Let's start with Blast, the kick drum pattern. I've got a kick drum sequence from the BeatStep Pro here I'm going to use again. And I'm starting with the shape comp through ZFM and body all the way down. I've got a bit of a pitch envelope. I'm just going to keep it kind of in the middle there, not too zappy just yet. Let's just add a little bit of the shape folding, a bit of compression and a bit of body. And it's sounding pretty punchy. I've got an accent pattern connected here as well. And I've got an external oscillator just with a sine wave, which I've patched to the through 0 FM, and I've tuned that so that when I bring up the through ZFM slider, we get a nice bit of this kind of FME tone. I don't want as much as that, but I just want a little suggestion of this kind of pitch. It's a slightly different flavour to the shape. So between these two, with a bit of compression and body, we've got a pretty punchy kick there. And you can see the accents. I've patched out the amplitude envelope just to the scope so you can see what's happening there. The steps in between are a bit quieter. So let's move over to some hats. So this is a pretty straightforward pattern. I've got the choke on. If I turn the choke off for a second, see I've got a fairly long decay on the open hat. And without the choke, this gets a little bit muddy with these sounds overlapping. So let's put the choke back on. Nice tight hi-hat pattern. And I've got a slow LFO coming into the frequency input there, which is just giving us this kind of slight, almost like a phasing effect, sweeping the frequency of that open hat, which sounds quite nice. So let's bring that all together. And I've got a snare from Platts just in the kind of snare mode. I'm submixing the snare and the two hats up here in Quadrat and then going into the second channel of the Megatang. And I'm sending a bit of that to Time Machine, which is my delay effect just off screen. Kick drum's completely dry otherwise. So that's a pretty punchy little pattern. Let's add a bass line. So this is the Beanie Bunny Moo Moo oscillator off screen running through the Analog Filter 8 and the Expert Sleepers Persephone VCA with an envelope from Contour 1. Really simple subtractive patch. I've got a tiny smidgen of delay on that, but that's working pretty well. The bass line. So let's bring in some chords. These are coming from the ALM MCO, which I'm just drugging from the sequencer channel, the Beatstep Pro, and using the internal envelope and the internal chord mode. And this gives us a nice rich Juno-y sort of pad. I'm taking the inverted envelope again from Blast just to duck those chords when the kick's hitting. And that kick's really punching through the mix nicely. So I'll leave it there. Hopefully this video has given you some ideas for how to use drums in your own setup, as well as letting you hear how these particular modules sound. If you've enjoyed it, please leave a like and a comment and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Thanks again to Patching Panda for sponsoring the video, thanks to you for watching, and I'll see you next time.